morning, folks. My name is Vikrant Karveer. I am a repeat entrepreneur. Today, I have two very seasoned veteran CISOs with me, Tim Brown.
Absolutely. So Tim Brown, CISO for SolarWinds, been there for about 8 years. Before that, I built a lot of product, heavy identity focus, been thinking about insider threats probably for 30 years. So look forward to our conversation.
And Ganesh Krishnan, who is a CISO as well as an entrepreneur.
Thank you for having me here. So my name is Ganesh Krishnan. My background is primarily as a CISO and a security practitioner. I was CISO at companies like Yahoo, LinkedIn, Atlassian. Before becoming an entrepreneur, started a company in cloud security, which was acquired by Sophos, and then now I've started another company in the insider risk space.
Today, we are going to talk about the broader area of insider risk, the area of user risk. How do you manage user risk? How do you manage human-centered breaches or prevent human-centered breaches in organizations? Frame this to get the conversations going. So I'm going to refer to Horizon 2024 data breach report, which says that 68% of the breaches involved a non-malicious human. It could be like a person falling victim to a social engineering attack, or it could be actually a malicious insider. As a veteran CISO, what are your reactions to this finding? Why does this happen so frequently? Any thoughts? And maybe Tim, we can get started with you on this issue.
Yeah, so not surprising, right? If you look at the insider landscape, right, it's important to not just think about that malicious insider. So when you take that into account, was somebody's account taken over? Did somebody's account act not with them knowing about it? So non-malicious insiders, was it a mistake that occurred that was non-malicious at all? People tend to generally think insider threat is always malicious users. But when you expand it out to the real kind of threat, it's somebody acting upon that user, an actor, a user making a mistake, that insider making a mistake, or in some cases, which is quite a bit less, the insider is actually truly a malicious actor doing things in the background. And I think we need to think about all three of those models.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more with Tim. Another way to look at this would be like, insider risk overall is like an iceberg. At the tip of the iceberg is the malicious insider. And the 90% at the bottom that you can't see is all the accidental, negligent mistakes that insiders are making. It forms 2/3 of security risk, as you refer to the Verizon data breach numbers. And I think that it's really important to pay attention to that risk and figure out how to systematically solve for that risk.
Tim, you have been through a lot and you have seen a lot, right? I mean, you are one of the few CISOs who's been there, done that, seen it, on all facets and still growing, right? And we've talked about this, right? In past, you have talked about how do you baseline user risk in your organizations? You talk about the 80-20. Could you give us your perspective on how do you baseline your organization, right, for the broad accidental negligent risk? And how do you focus on the malicious 20% of minority risk?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you think about your user population, there's no way that you can treat everybody super special, right? If you try to do that, your budget needs to go up quite a bit, right? You need to be able to, just thinking about trying to monitor 100% of your population to the same extent that you really should be monitoring, your most risky users. So I think getting to a baseline, I think that's one of the important parts. Where are you comfortable that everybody should have? And it depends on the organization, right? Our organization, we ended up doing YubiKey for everybody, those types of things. But not everybody can get there. But that's the baseline you have to work towards. Then, who are your special people? Your system administrators, those having access to sensitive data. I haven't been in an organization where it's 100% of the people that are special, right? Now, those special people, you really do want to do more, and you want to do things such as refreshing their authentication all the time, giving them additional prompts when they're doing something, enforcing hardware token, or enforcing other methods to be able to authenticate, auditing them, logging them, potentially looking at the behavior that they're doing. Also designing systems that protect them from being coerced. I love the scenario for the convenience store, right? Convenience store gets robbed. What's in the drawer? Well, under $20, because every $20 I put into the safe and I don't have the combination. So how do we put those types of safeguards in place for our most users that are both most at risk? Probably those users present most risk to the company as well. So I think tiering is very important when you think about how you're going to protect an environment.
Very thoughtful, right? In some ways, you're saying like look into the physical world of security. There are some things that people have learned over a period of time. See if you can actually, implement those constructs in the cyber world.
Yep. Assume breach, right? I mean, that's what the convenience store is assuming. They've been assuming somebody's going to come in and rob them. Okay, well, how do I protect the customer? Well, they just can't get at the money. Everything I could, but I can't get at the money for you. Here's what's in the drawer. So similar concept that we want to help implement in the cyber world for people that have sensitive data. So just like the 2 keys for, the old missile launch, right? They can't do it alone. So all sorts of different mechanisms, but that's the concept we should be thinking of.
Ganesh, what's your take on this, right? The broad area of user risk and then insider risk,
couldn't agree more that the different aspects that Tim already articulated, right? Starting with the baseline risk assessment and of course, monitoring special people and then implementing guardrails where necessary and possible, right? Like passkey-based authentication is a much stronger guardrail to basic SMS-based MFA. So you may want to actually better protect at least your special people with passkeys, right? And I think the more guardrails we can have, the better it is. And that's what it was in the physical world. Those are all guardrails, right? So people don't shoot themselves in the foot. How can we make sure that people don't shoot themselves?
So building on this conversation, right? So as you establish essentially a baseline, right? And let's say, as part of establishing the baseline, there are certain types of security constructs, simple 2-factor authentication on phone. You don't want to do that. You want to go to a multi-factor authentication. Maybe you want to take the phone out and introduce essentially some sort of authenticator, right? As an example, those type of constructs. So as you raise the bar, how do you guys, and anyone can go, how do you guys, have these security controls business conversation with your business counterparts, right? So for example, I've been an entrepreneur, but in past life, I've been a BPGM, right? You're focused on business, you don't have time. And now essentially, the security team is sitting down with you and talking about controls, user risk, issues. Is this going to stop my team? Is this going to stop the collaboration? Is it going to basically stop time to market activities? Reactions on that, thoughts on that?
I'll go first for a second. I mean, it's always a balance, right? If you're putting friction into the system because of security, that's always kind of a balance. If you can get to we've seen great strides in passwordless, for example, over the last little while. Passwordless removes friction. I haven't typed a password, I don't know, probably a year and a half. And it's wonderful, right? I either use my face with hello or my YubiKey, I get in. So my password rotates in the background or does stuff in the background I never see, right? So, but that's not always the case. So that situation is not there. So I think in some cases that security needs to just be policy and a trump. Sometimes painful, but if you get the opportunity to do some of that, then it's worthwhile, right? If you can. But other times that friction is in place. So again, you need to work with people. You need to try to implement things that eliminate friction as much as possible. You need to educate people on the why, give them both education around, hey, this is the way that you should be dealing with your identity at home as well as in the office. This is the reason why we're asking these things. This is, give them training, give them examples of, hey, this is what happened at so-and-so. It was caused by a password that wasn't set right, an insider that was compromised. So I think there's a lot of ways to educate to eliminate some friction as well as utilize technology the best we can.
The one thing I would add to that is in the previous discussion, we talked about a baseline risk assessment to the problem. And if you can make that risk assessment continuous, then you can you have the data about what's going on within the organization, and data-driven discussions with the business make things 100 times easier versus policy level discussion. Is that, okay, X% of salespeople, just picking an example, could be any team, continue to install risky applications in our environment. Maybe we should do something about whitelisting, or maybe we should put some controls in place, right? Then it becomes an open discussion about what's going on, and then what are the consequences of if we let that continuously go. And so I think what I'd suggest is make the risk assessment continuous, and then that gives the data for.
I'd say that the baseline concept's important in a number of different ways, right? So if you're baselining, if you look at behavior baselines, if you look at other, not just identity, but what people are doing, look at propensity to be coerced or propensity to be infected. That helps you as well when you start looking at either, right? It's more propensity to be. So therefore, you're going to take actions on those who have a higher propensity to be coerced or infected or misused.
Makes sense. My question to both of you is, in these conversations, how important is it to have some sort of like an audit trail or auditable data that you actually use to have these conversations? Is that like how you guys approach it, or there's some other approaches to make this conversation a little bit easier and more effective?
Data always makes it easier, right? As Ganesh said, right? If you come in with data that says, here are the compromises that we stopped, or here are things that got, a few links down the chain, which they shouldn't have gotten, and we could have caught something earlier. So data is always helpful in these conversations, always helpful to really drive direction forward.
I would agree. I mean, in my past life, I've gotten burned several times with this because, in the past, I tended to take a more best practices based approach, policy based approach. And if I couldn't back that up with data, it became harder to justify if there was pushback from the business. Not everything gets pushed back, but for the stuff that does get pushed back, having data as a backup is like invaluable.
Building on that, right? Now, you have data, you have certain insights. How can you trust that? And Tim, you often talked about this, right? Well, could you educate the audience on how can you trust insights? Can you trust insights? How do you trust? What's your approach?
Data from individuals is sometimes hard to trust. Technical data is a little bit better. Why data from individuals is sometimes hard to trust, like when you're doing an audit, is from their perspective, they believe what they're telling you. The problem that I've seen in certain circumstances, the data that they are believed to be true is scoped within their knowledge. Right? It's nothing personal. They're not trying to be deceitful. It's simply that within their base of knowledge, this is what they believe is true. You have to take yourself out of that type of data and try to move towards more technical data that can't be disagreed upon so much, right? That this data shows that, this many people were authenticating from these different places. This many people, have potentially moved or had a risky connection. This many people have, as long as the data is good, right? Then you can have an accurate conversation. Now, there's a lot of problems with our technical data not being as accurate as it could be either, though. If you look at just Microsoft in general, it's impossible movement type, just not very good, right? Because somebody goes on a VPN and they go onto here and then they get an impossible movement scenario that says, oh, this person isn't. So we have to try to eliminate some of those false positives in order to have really solid things to make decisions on.
And I completely agree. And, in this day and age of AI, I'm probably going to make a controversial statement here, is that deterministic data is the most trustworthy, right? If you can say somebody installed these apps on their machines, that's deterministic. It's trustworthy. Something like a impossible travel thing is predicting, saying, oh, this is probably a malicious login. That's not necessarily trustworthy because it depends on a set of inputs that were used to arrive at that point. So whenever you look at things like scoring or predictive analysis, there is an element of uncertainty.
So predictive analytics, insights from that, right? And as you were saying, Ganesh, and as Tim, you're pointing out, right? But what is the reality behind it? What is the deterministic data set? And you could actually go into, sort of a hubris.
Yeah, but you can weight certain data knowing that it's more accurate than others. Trustworthiness of data would probably need to be put into your model, right? How much data, how much of this data are you going to trust? Things that absolutely you can trust. But I think if you look at where we could get, right, we've been trying to get from deviations from normal for many, many years. The problem is that the volume of data to determine what normal is, and then the compute power to look at deviations was very hard to overcome. Do I think we might be getting close? Yeah, we might be getting close, yeah, to being able to do that. So then you're saying, okay, what's the likelihood this is Tim Brown on the other side of here? Well, it's 68.5%. Okay, well, but trustworthy wise, right? And there's a lot of factors like deep fakes that are going into saying, is this really me here? It's a whole different thing. But I think the idea for deviations from normal, you can get there. Now, that can help a lot in your equations. Well, just because it's Tim Brown, now I've got confidence there, but do I have confidence he should be doing these activities? He's never done these activities before. So is this something that's normal for him, or should I look further and deeper? So it's not just the fact that the human person is linked to that logical identity, but it's also is that logical identity doing something that it normally would do, or is he being coerced, or is machine taken over, or something else? So it's not just proving that Tim is Tim.
Fascinating. Ganesh, what's your take on this? This is a fascinating area, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think, if I were to take like a security engineer or practitioner's approach, right? What people are really looking for is not to get flooded with 1,000 of these at any one time. Right now, if you get something that's close enough, I think people will tolerate it. But if you get a bunch of inaccurate predictions, a number of times, then the tolerance goes down. What is the false positive rate for these things that stops people from looking at these things?
Just then you let me set that bar and dial that up for my special people and lower for my not special people.
And in this, where do you bring your red teams, right? So you got basically a bunch of tools. You're essentially going from a set of deterministic data to some sort of like predictive insights. So you're looking into the behavioral pattern. You got human identities, maybe non-human identities. You're looking into the physical identity, and then what is the logical behavior? It can get fairly complicated, right? And it can also be a situation where you're missing out on the basics. I don't know. It could happen. Tim, what's your take? And so red teams, strategic resource, high value resource. How do you deploy it? What's the thought process?
A combination of, there's a couple different things. So internal audit. So I have a team that does internal security audit, not financial audit. So when you look at audit, that gives me a level of assurity from an audit perspective, right? It's a different level of assurity than a red team perspective, right? They work together, and the audit team audits, red team, certain functions, doesn't trust, proves that what the audit said was essentially true or not true, and looks across it. The audit, if you've gone through financial audit, right, what they do is look at samplings of things, right? And that sampling says, but nobody's trying to defeat the controls that are in place. Red team comes in and attempts to compete or defeat those controls that are in place. So overall, when you look at saying, how does this entity score on my scorecard metrics, right? It says, it's been audited. Great. It's also been red teamed. Maybe it's been externally audited. Maybe it's been externally, red teamed. And that continues that strength model of whatever that entity is. So the big thing here is, that the assumptions, right, that the assumptions can get you into trouble. So it's important to check those assumptions through whatever mechanisms you may have in play or you may have available to yourself.
Absolutely. I think completely agree. I think the way I would try and summarize this is like that defenders need to think and operate like attackers. So it's not sufficient to say, I'm a defender and I have a bunch of tools and it's giving me data. Going an extra mile to say, okay, let me operate like an attacker and see what I can find. And that's really what the red team is for. Right. So
building on that, have you guys seen a shift in terms of where the red teams are spending more time, or maybe you want them to like social engineering, right? phishing related? Any thoughts over there?
Yeah, a lot of things are taken from threat intel right now, kind of what worked. What did we see happen? So if you're just looking at not the the TTPs that come out and are they effective within your organization, absolutely doing that. But then looking at, all right, so when this attack occurred, they social engineered their way in through XYZ help desk or through or through the exec team or through the finance team or through the so taking the scenarios that you see that are very active in an environment or active from our threat actors and then modeling them. What happens if your email gets compromised? Are you going to see it? Are you going to, if you don't see it, how much harm could that do? What would it lead you to? But a lot of the attacks that you see that are working usually kind of start at, oh, well, I social engineered myself into some external service, whether it be a help desk service or whether it be a IT service or whether it be a sales rep or a customer support person side of that. So understanding what attacks are working and then also doing red teaming the social side of it.
Makes sense. Ganesh, if I may frame this for you, right? So one aspect is red teaming, using that strategically, as Kim was saying, right? And more focused, among other things, right? They have to do what they have to do, right? And then you got internal audit. But conceptually, you got basically you're unifying alerts into a user risk, for lack of better term, dashboard or, charts. You're having auditable data, right? Can you talk about how those two efforts can convert?
Yeah, I mean, you could have, like we were going back to, a continuous risk assessment. And I think the auditable efforts could leverage some of that data to focus their testing, like what Tim was alluding to, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like pick certain sample controls and actually validate them. And one of the problems I think today is like a standard pen test doesn't necessarily include a social engineering aspect. Pen test for an audit, they're just basically trying to do like a scan from the outside or like trying to test your application, depending on what is it that you're trying to audit. It's really a special case and it shouldn't be. And I think like all pen tests should require and have some element of social engineering or some way to attack the people, because that's how we see all the breaches happening, right? And I think that particular thing is a gap, but all the data should be leveraged by red teams and other pen testers to validate control. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think they're both required, right? So
they are very complementary. They build on each other. And based on just a question for both of you, Tim and Ganesh, right? Based on what you're saying, right? Is this a continuous process? Once a quarter, once a month? I mean, everybody has a different construct. Any best practices over there that you guys have seen?
And continuous is always better, right? Just a logical fact, right? Continually training people, continuing to have them understand what to recognize, continuing to have them ask questions. Important when we look at people, right? So we have to remember that we've got a human behind it, right? And it's not a logical representation of me that's doing something. It's probably me or somebody that's taken over my doing something. So how do we put the safeguards for the people? How do we help them communicate better? How do we help them ask the right question? The AI campaigns for phishing right now are getting so good that there's a lot of different models to enable trust with a human that gets taken advantage of. Their job of defending against these things is getting harder and harder and harder. So back to the how do we look at the overall protection of them, it's important that we look at it holistically, not just, oh, we're going to stop you from answering this perfectly crafted message from your boss that says something textual that you won't fall for, because it's getting to be that point. So again, how do we make it so that they can't somehow, if they don't notice it, how do we make it so that they can't do harm on the back end?
Got it. In interest of time, one key question, right? In this day and age, and we had a lot of news around this, agent versus agentless models. How do you guys approach that, right? There are pros and cons to this. Tim, based on your experience, agent-based solutions versus agentless solutions. Any take over there? And maybe Ganesh, you can also.
Just in general, agentless are easier to deploy usually. They're easier to get data from. They Yeah, the question is granularity, which they can provide, right? There's certain cases where you need more data that or more protection at the device itself. But yeah, the more agents you get, the more issues you're going to have, the more conflicts you're going to have. All of those things absolutely true. So agentless ends up being a much easier deployment on that side, but you don't always get the fidelity that you may want in an agentless environment. So it's always a balance.
I mean, it's a trade-off, right? How much deeper detections you want versus ease of deployment and better resiliency. I am more of a believer in agentless because I feel like there's already so many agents in cybersecurity that people are running. People at this point should be able to build agentless solutions that actually leverage the existing agents. That's just my belief. Now, the reality may be different because a lot of these agents or like a lot of vendors in cybersecurity are still closed. They are not necessarily API centric or open up their data, which is a problem. I think there should be a way to better leverage data from different vendors so that some of these problems can be solved more creatively versus CISOs having to deploy an agent for every different type of use case they want.
Tim, if I may ask you the final question, right? 3 pieces of advice to your peer group on managing insider and user risk within your organization.
Let's see. So we've always been looking for an inflection point where the creation of malware is going to be too expensive versus an insider. I do think we're coming upon that inflection point that you really need to seriously think about the insider as a risk, both the malicious insider as well as the other types of insider, of course. But this is really the malicious insider. I do think that they are going to play a stronger role in the next few years for circumventing security with enterprises. So think about that in your systems. Think about assumed breach. All of those things need to come forward. I do think that we can get better on behavioral analytics in some ways and really truly understand potentially. Take a lot of processing. I have hope for AI in this area that we could get to there. Is it really me acting as me in a certain circumstance? And the other one is to try to tier your organization somewhat. Do an incredible job at your high level folk or your highest risk folks, and which means you'll probably not be able to afford to do that for everyone. So get to a baseline, do great at the baseline, but then treat some people special in the org.
Awesome. Folks, interest of time, we'll do a wrap. Thank you so much, Tim, for your time. Ganesh, thanks for your time.